Hi friends, we're here to talk about the last section of A.S. Byatt's The Children's Book. I guess the first thing we'll start with is the things that we didn't like about the novel. So you want to start us off with something you didn't like, and then we'll talk about some things that we did like.
Well, I had sort of a split experience with the novel because I read some of it and I listened to some of it. And I think that the listening heightened what I thought was a problem in the novel, which is a section that's, if there was a section that started with, in the summer of 1906 in Berlin, and I would just see myself drift off and not focus as tightly listening to it. If I was reading, I could stay with it a little while, but those historical sections where Byatt's placing someone in context or showing them at the leading edge of some cultural movement were interesting, but they didn't seem to sort of advance the story with the same kind of urgency and depth as other sections.
I mean, they did advance the story because everything she was doing was kind of setting us up for the precursors to World War I. I guess the way I would explain it is that there was a weird voice that sort of stepped in at those points. Most of the novel is written in limited third-person point of view, meaning when you're reading about Olive, you're getting it from her perspective. When you're reading about Philip, you're getting it from his perspective. And then this odd, disembodied, omniscient narrator steps in to give us a history lesson every 50 pages or so. And it's just really off-putting. Sometimes the characters are woven into the history, but in a very sort of superficial way.
And I don't remember there being these passages in the first half of the novel.
Right. It started to happen later on.
I mean, I would love to see Byatt's library, because the research that she does is fabulous, and her understanding of pottery and of glazes and all sorts of detailed things. She obviously has such just grasping mind that was fascinating.
Well, she obviously has a good grasp of history as well. That's what we're getting in those sections, but it was just, there was something clunky about it. So yeah, that was one thing that both of us disliked. I think maybe also the volume of characters that we had to follow. I never made a list of characters, but I finally sat down and listed the families, and I realized it was really only 4 families. The two branches of the Wellwood family, the Floods, the Canes, and then Philip and Elsie. So like when I looked at it that way, I thought, oh, it's only 4 families.
Right.
It seems like not that many people, but the interconnections were really complex, and I had to keep flipping back and reminding myself, now, why is so-and-so doing this? So you said you felt like the novel needed to be longer, actually.
This needs to be a trilogy, because there were sections where it would start developing a scene with a character, and, there are these nuances, and it would last a paragraph, and then you're on to another character. And you could almost see Byatt writing from an outline.
Yeah.
And I wish that somebody had either said, get rid of that character, or if more interesting, if they had said, let's give this the full room that it needs and break it up into several books.
Yeah. It's tricky, right? Because she's really trying to write about the lead up to World War I. And so you don't want the story to spill over those boundaries of time, historical time. In some cases, I think the light touch, like, I don't think we really needed to know the 2 Robins any better than we did. It was enough to know just that little passage when they happen to be in the same regiment and they finally acknowledge, I've always thought that my father was your father.
Yeah.
I don't think that their characters really needed to be developed any more than that.
Right.
But other aspects of the story maybe did.
Well, one character who I kind of liked, and we have sort of mixed reads of this, is Gabriel, who I think that he's this sort of fairy tale character who comes in and sort of saves Florence. But in my read of it, they have a really good relationship, and there's something about him that really clicks. And my frustration is that he kind of comes in from nowhere.
And then goes.
Yeah.
I didn't really think it was a love story. I thought it was more a marriage of convenience, that he was helping her out. And So one more thing that I didn't like about the novel that I just want to mention before we go on to talk about what we did like about it was that I felt as if there were two different frames that Byatt was trying to use here. One was pottery. Just as you mentioned a few minutes ago, she has so much rich detail about how pottery is made and all the vocabulary that goes along with it. And so it really seems to be carrying some weight as a metaphor in the novel. And then there's this amazing scene pretty late in the novel where they have a camp, a pottery camp, and Philip is filling up this huge kiln with all the pieces. It's as if the pieces are the characters. The whole construction is very fragile. It could
And there are
collapse.
surprise glazes that come out.
They come out unexpectedly, but I felt like here we are at the moment in the book when the characters are being fired. They're going to go through a trial by fire and take their final form, which of course ends up being the war. And so it seemed like such a perfect metaphor for the novel. And yet, I don't think it really ends up being the central metaphor, because the other competing metaphor is storytelling. I think that for me ended up being the more important or compelling theme. But that pottery theme was so powerful, it seemed to be in competition with it. And they didn't really seem to work together to me. I don't know.
It wasn't about artistry. It wasn't that there was common ground that they were building up together.
I mean, I think the book is about art. But I don't think that those two big frames necessarily played off each other in the way they would have to in order to coexist as shared frames for the novel. So let's talk about a couple of big themes of the novel.
Heart and head. One of my favorite scenes in the novel when Dorothy is holding the heart in her hand and falls in love.
Yeah.
Right?
Or she faints, actually.
Right?
Yeah.
And for her, there's this conflict between her passions and her career. She's got to find the right balance for herself. And then there are people like Olive, who struggles to balance, this passion to write and this passion to convert life into story with her growing knowledge that this is bad, this is harmful.
Well, or it can be anyway. So that plays into the theme that I wanted to talk about, which is the power of stories. Beware of stories. They have more power than you think they have. I think that theme comes up over and over again through the novel, the most obvious example of which is what happens to Tom as a result of Olive kind of co-opting his story for commercial use. And without telling him or asking his permission, and not really understanding how deeply personal that story was to him. Even as an adult, she just, ironically, the storyteller in the novel doesn't understand the power of her own stories. There's also this passage at the very end of the novel that both of us kind of homed in on. Do you want to read it? Because you have it marked.
Sure. So this is next to last page of the novel. And this is the final dinner where things are happening. They sat, the survivors, quietly around the dinner table and drank to the memory of Leon. Ghosts occupied their minds and crowded in the shadows behind them. They all had things they could not speak of and could not free themselves from. Stories they survived only by never telling them, although they woke at night surprised by foul dreams which returned regularly and always as a new shock.
Yeah, and I underlined or copied down stories they survived only by never telling them. I mean, they all have these stories now, and they're true stories that have some really strong power over them, and the best thing to do is to suppress them, or they can't go on. But of course, you can't entirely suppress them because they come back up in your dreams.
In this little passage, there is a sense, though, of they're settled. Things are not necessarily good or happy, but they're okay. And these are people who have seen lives ruined, families challenged, but there is a sense of possibility and a sense of a future.
I mean, it's the rule in fiction that you have to leave the reader with some sense of redemption. And if you don't, you're writing a postmodern novel. Or, people will be very disappointed. You could argue that stories are supposed to be realistic and life isn't that way, but actually I would argue stories aren't supposed to be realistic. We read stories because we're seeking that kind of redemption at the end. What I find really interesting about the end of the novel is that it's all taking place at Basil Wellwood's house in London, not Toad Fright. So it seems through most of the novel that Toad Fright is the central location, and everything revolves around Olive and her stories and that house. In the end, we're left with a really grim scene at Toad Fright, and then the last, 25 pages are devoted to Basil and Katharina's house and the story of what occurs there. And we end around their dining room table with the characters, the survivors, essentially. I mean, others survive, but really basically the survivors seated around the dining table. And I think that it's really interesting that Byatt seems to be rewarding this family that we really haven't heard that much from.
And I developed tremendous sympathy for them as they get exiled by their social circles.
Because she's German.
Right.
Even though she's lived in England for, 20 or 30 years.
Right. I think that part of the contrast with the opening chapters is the opening chapters, in an almost literal way, had the sense of a stage, right, or a performance.
Well, because it opens with that party, right?
Right. Whereas this is people who have kind of drifted into this meal and are together not because it's been orchestrated in that sort of grand way, but in a more kind of sober, realistic way.
Yeah, and I didn't realize until we were just saying it that it opens and closes with a party, only they're very different. Yeah. One of the other things we've said in every video is how great Byatt is about writing children. And we had speculated in the beginning that the children were too old to be soldiers in the war, and that only the youngest ones would end up going to war, which we were wrong about, because I guess I didn't really realize, when you talk about the Vietnam War, the average age of the soldiers was 19. But in World War I, there were apparently many men in their 20s as well fighting. So we miscalculated that. I think we thought in the beginning, is she in this lead up to World War I setting up all these kids are going to go off to war? No, it couldn't be. They're too old. But they weren't too old. That is exactly what she was doing. I was thinking back to what we had said in earlier videos about the adults being so clueless about so many things and the kids being so sharp and smart about it. And then sure enough, the adults are so clueless that they then send the children off to war to be killed. I didn't see it until it happened, but it's almost like the reason why she was telling everything so sympathetically from the point of view of the children earlier in the novel is because the children are the ones who are going to grow up and have to go off to war because their elders are so stupid that they create this war that never should have happened. That seemed to be foreshadowed in the entire first section of the novel. I mean, the war really doesn't come up until 50 pages from the end of the novel.
No, and some of the deaths that happen in the war are such snuffings, where a paragraph will be going along, a character is there, and then they're not.
Yeah.
There's no preparation for it. They're in the scene and they're dead.
Yeah. Which is how it happens sometimes. So she writes war pretty well, even though it's all sort of told in summary. It happens very quickly in the last 50 pages of the novel. So did you find the novel satisfying overall? Like, was it worth an 875-page read for you?
I enjoyed checking in with the characters and seeing how they were going. And each character I was rooting for at some time or another, although I did have trouble sort of sorting out whose story this is.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting slant or device in the book. But it did also leave me, as I alluded to before, wanting a little more out of these characters. I loved watching Byatt at work.
Yeah.
I mean, this is I think in a way, even with some things that I think are flaws, this is a great book for seeing a novel working and a novelist at work.
I mean, the flaws are part of what you learn from, too.
Yeah.
If you're thinking like a writer reading this novel, but what about somebody who's just like an ordinary reader who's just reading for pleasure?
I think this is a great summer book.
Yeah.
Right? When you have the days feel a little longer and you can devote those
Depending
hours.
on what you're doing, yeah. I mean, you could argue it's a great winter book too.
What's the common thing? It's a great book.
Yeah. I mean, it is so rich and so full of, I feel like we're not beginning to do it justice in this conversation. There's so many moving parts and so many interesting smaller stories coming together, and so much to think about in terms of relationships and art and war. And I mean, it just covers so much ground.
You know what? I have a word for it. Opulent.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. It's an opulent novel. Not just in terms of the richness of the characters and their relationships, but also in terms of Byatt's language. We've talked about that before.
But there are also sections that are just fun to read, and they might take a little longer than a modernist would want or something like that. But the writing is gorgeous, or she's really working something up, and just the pleasure of the artistry is part of the opulence.
Yeah, I mean, even just the last few lines of the novel, the way she's pulling it all together, describing how Katharina is giving everyone soup. So there's this sense of like she's giving out this comforting, warm food to everyone, and it keeps echoing that she gave more soup to this person, she gave more soup to that person. And then the last couple lines, delicate dumplings lurked beneath the golden surface on which a veil of finely chopped parsley eddied and swayed. Steam rose to meet the fine smoke from the candles, and all their faces seemed softer in their quavering light. There's that redemption that I was talking about. It's not a happy ending, but it leaves you feeling, it leaves you in a comfortable space, feeling like the people who've survived this war are going to be okay.
Yeah.
Because they're together.
Right. And also, I mean, the light is quavering, but it's light.
Yeah. Bottom line, we enjoyed our reading of the children's book. It's probably not for everyone. It's pretty dark. If I was going to read one A.S. Byatt book, I would still recommend Possession over this. But I'm actually feeling like I'm going to go on an A.S. Byatt kick. I just think she's really great, and I want to go dig up what else has she written. I think she's really one of my favorite writers. So she didn't let us down.
Nope.
So if you've also read the children's book, we would love to hear from you in the comments section below. We don't have another big read planned yet, but I don't know.
I thought we were going to do Finnegan's Wake.
No way. But we'll let you know if and when we decide to do this again. We hope you'll join in. And that's it for A.S. Byatt's The Children's Book.